It was a quiet, unassuming morning when Officer Derek Walker, a man who swore to protect and serve, crossed paths with someone who would shatter his perception of authority, humanity, and honor. On the surface, it seemed like any other traffic stop. But little did Walker know, this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. The sun hung low over the city, casting long shadows across the street. Walker had just finished his shift and was heading home, the weight of the day's work pressing heavily on his mind. But as he pulled his squad car to a stop beside a parked vehicle, something caught his eye. A man struggling to make his way along the sidewalk, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. Walker's gaze narrowed as he took in the man's features. A black man, clearly disabled, moving slowly but purposefully. There was something about him that struck Walker as odd, but he couldn't put his finger on it. His instincts told him that this was a man who didn't belong in the same world as the streets he now walked. But instead of letting the man pass without incident, Walker's internal prejudices began to surface. He couldn't help but feel a sense of superiority, the kind of unspoken bias that often lurked beneath the surface in the minds of some. The uniform he wore had given him a false sense of control, a misguided belief that he was above reproach. Without a second thought, he rolled down his window and barked an order. "Hey you, move along!" The man froze mid-step, clearly startled by the abrupt tone. He was no stranger to prejudice, but the words hit him like a fist. Still, he didn't flinch. The disabled man, who had already fought battles most people would never understand, turned slowly to face Walker. His eyes were calm, even though the weight of the world seemed to rest upon his shoulders. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked in a voice that held a quiet dignity. His words were measured, but there was an edge of weariness there, as though he had encountered this kind of behavior countless times before. But Walker wasn't listening. His mind was clouded by the assumptions that had already taken root. He saw a man, vulnerable and isolated, and in that moment he saw an opportunity to assert dominance, without realizing the life-altering consequences that would follow. "Step out of the vehicle," Walker commanded, his voice rising with each syllable. "I said move." The man shook his head, his cane tapping once again against the concrete. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said, his voice steady. "I've got my own battles to fight, officer. I don't need you to make it harder." But Walker wasn't having it. He stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting on his holstered gun, ready to escalate a situation that didn't require escalation. He reached forward, his fingers brushing against the man's wheelchair, attempting to make the man stand up. That's when it happened, the moment when everything shifted. The man who had remained calm up until this point stood with an unexpected force, pushing himself up from the chair. Walker's eyes widened, not in disbelief but in realization that he had misjudged the situation entirely. The man before him wasn't just anyone. He was someone. "You've made a mistake," the man said, his voice changing now, as though something had stirred deep within him. His posture straightened and his eyes, those calm eyes, shifted with a quiet fury. As the disabled man slowly turned his back to Walker, Walker noticed something he hadn't before: the intricate design. On his jacket, the military pins, the insignia of rank, Commander. Walker's heart began to race as the realization set in. The man he had just tried to belittle wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was someone who had held a position of immense power, someone whose influence spanned continents. But before Walker could process the full extent of what was happening, the man, now standing tall, no longer the victim in this confrontation, turned slowly and revealed something that froze the blood in Walker's veins. A metal prosthetic leg, polished and gleaming in the sun, glinted menacingly as the man stood, defying the very label of disabled. It wasn't just any prosthetic leg, but one that spoke of a warrior's resolve. This man, this legendary Air Force commander, had fought and bled for his country, had sacrificed everything in the face of danger. And yet here he was, facing a man who didn't even recognize him. "Don't make the mistake of thinking you're in control here." The commander's voice rang out, low and full of authority. The cop, now realizing the magnitude of his error, took a step back, but it was too late. The encounter had already spiraled, and what was about to unfold would have consequences that neither of them could predict. Walker's judgment had led him down a dangerous path, but it was the commander's hidden power, the strength he had cultivated both in his past and in the face of Walker's arrogance, that would truly determine the course of this moment. And, as the tension hung in the air, the two men locked eyes, the officer's gaze filled with confusion and the commander's with something far more chilling, a promise that this confrontation wasn't over. Not by a long shot. What happens next is a story that is far from finished, a story of respect, power, and the dangerous consequences of underestimating the people around us. Stay tuned to find out how this encounter plays out, and how the officer's life will never be the same. The streets around them were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Walker stood there, still frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was the sudden shift in the air or the weight of his mistake, but something felt wrong. The man in front of him, the disabled man who had at first seemed like an easy target for a routine stop, now seemed to exude an aura of quiet danger. Walker's mind raced, trying to piece together the truth behind what he'd just discovered. A commander, an Air Force legend. And yet, it didn't make sense. How could a man of such stature end up here in a wheelchair, so far from the front lines of battle? The officer's hand instinctively hovered near his holster, though for what purpose he wasn't sure. Was he about to arrest this man for insubordination? Could he even do that? His pulse quickened, his mind grappling with the confusion. The man had done nothing wrong, and yet, here they were. "I don't have time for games, officer." The commander's voice cut through Walker's spiraling thoughts. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it, one that suggested he had been through more in a single lifetime than Walker could ever imagine. "You're looking at the wrong man if you think this is going to go your way." Walker swallowed, hard, but his body felt stiff, paralyzed by the realization of just how badly he had misjudged this situation. This wasn't just a random citizen who happened to be disabled. This was a man who had likely seen more combat, more pain, more sacrifice than Walker would ever experience in his lifetime. And now, in front of him, the man's calm demeanor seemed to be holding back something fierce, something wild, something terrifying. The commander shifted his weight, the metal prosthetic leg clicking against the sidewalk as he made a slow turn, his face still calm but with a glimmer of something darker in his eyes. He studied Walker for a moment, his gaze sharp and piercing as if he could see straight through the officer. The silence between them stretched out, each second thickening the tension. "Let me guess." The commander spoke again, his voice low but filled with an unspoken promise. "You think you can put me back in my place, don't you? Make me disappear, like everyone else who doesn't fit into your narrow view of the world." Walker's grip tightened around the wheel of his patrol car, his knuckles turning white. He had heard these kinds of accusations before from the civilians who felt oppressed by the system. But this time it felt different. It didn't feel like the typical resistance to authority. This man, he wasn't afraid. In fact, there was something almost daring in his gaze, as though he welcomed the confrontation. And the officer couldn't figure out why that made him feel so uneasy. The commander's voice softened, and for a split second, something in his demeanor shifted. "I don't need your sympathy, officer. I've fought for my country, sacrificed more than you'll ever know, and I lost more than just my leg." His eyes flashed, but the words were deliberate. "What's your excuse?" Walker took a step back, his breath caught in his chest. He didn't want to hear the truth, didn't want to face the reality of who he was standing in front of. This wasn't just a moment of tension. This was a reckoning. "I'm not looking for an argument," Walker said, his voice a little shakier than he intended. "I don't care about your past or who you think you are. I'm just trying to do my job." But as the words left his mouth, he could hear how hollow they sounded, how unconvincing. The commander raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Your job?" He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Your job is to serve and protect, right? Or have you forgotten what that means? The question hung in the air like a challenge, daring Walker to respond to prove that he could stand his ground. But the officer remained silent, his thoughts clouded by a mix of guilt and anger. He couldn't back down now. He was the one in control, wasn't he? He was the one wearing the badge. He had the power to decide what happened next. But the more Walker thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't about power. Not really. This was about something deeper, something he didn't fully understand. As if reading his mind, the commander took a step forward, his metal leg clicking against the pavement with each movement. You have no idea who you're dealing with, officer, he said quietly, his voice edged with authority. But you're about to learn. This isn't just some random encounter. This isn't just a disabled man in a wheelchair. This is a man who has led men into battle, who has fought in wars you couldn't even begin to comprehend. The commander paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in before continuing. And now I'm here, on your streets, and you're the one who made the mistake, not me. Walker took a shaky breath, the heat of the situation pressing down on him from all sides. He couldn't help but feel the world shifting beneath his feet. This was no longer a simple case of racial profiling or an ordinary stop. This was something bigger, something that, if he wasn't careful, could turn into a nightmare. The commander's gaze never wavered, his eyes locked onto Walker's with an intensity that made the officer feel small, insignificant. You think you've got power, the commander continued, his tone quiet but unyielding. You think you can take control of this situation? You're not in control here, officer. Not anymore. Walker opened his mouth to protest, but before he could get the words out, the commander turned his back, his cane tapping lightly on the sidewalk as he began to walk away. The officer stood frozen, his body trembling with an unspoken fear. Something told him that this wasn't the end of this encounter. The commander's footsteps echoed in the stillness, and just as Walker was about to call out, a low voice stopped him in his tracks. You'll remember me, the commander said, his back still turned. You'll remember this moment, and you'll understand why I'm not the one who should be afraid. And then, without another word, he disappeared into the distance, leaving Walker standing there, shaken and unsure of what had just transpired. Walker stood there for a long time, his eyes locked on the spot where the commander had disappeared, into the shadowy street. The silence felt heavier now, like the weight of the encounter had pressed down on him in ways he couldn't understand. His mind raced, replaying the moments over and over. That calm confidence the commander had, almost, as if he had seen it all before. And the way Walker had been left reeling, unsure of himself for the first time in what felt like forever. The officer's chest tightened. He wasn't used to feeling this vulnerable. He wasn't used to feeling small. Taking a deep breath, he reached for his radio, fingers trembling as he keyed the mic. Unit 2310-4, I'll be clear in a few. Just need a moment. His voice didn't sound like his own. It didn't have the usual authority, the usual sharpness. The words seemed to float into the air, hanging there in the same heavy silence that had taken over the street. What was it about that man? He was just an ordinary civilian, right? But no, nothing about this felt ordinary. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he had spoken. Walker couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed paths with someone far beyond his understanding, someone who had faced challenges that no one could truly grasp without having lived them. And yet, here they were. He was the one with the badge, with the power, but the commander seemed to have the upper hand. And then there was the matter of his leg, the metal prosthetic that had made Walker's earlier assumptions so much more dangerous. The officer had assumed it was a weakness, that it would somehow give him an advantage. But now, after hearing that quiet authority, he knew he had been wrong. For the first time in his career, Walker wasn't sure if he wanted to finish this shift. His gut told him that this was far from over, that there was something more to this man than met the eye. He thought about the years of training, the endless hours spent in the academy. But none of it had prepared him for this. None of it had prepared him for a man who could turn the world upside down with just a few words, a few subtle movements. In the distance, a muffled car engine hummed, drawing him back to reality. Walker's hand dropped from the radio and he finally began to move, heading back to his patrol car. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he knew that his shift was far from over. The commander was still out there somewhere, and the tension between them was thick enough to slice with a knife. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, the commander sat in a small diner, his metal leg propped up on the chair beside him. He didn't need to look around to know that he had attracted attention. The moment he had walked in, the whispers had begun. A man in a wheelchair wasn't exactly a regular sight in this part of town, and when the metal leg was added to the equation, people's curiosity was piqued. But he didn't care. He didn't care what they thought, what they whispered about behind his back. He'd lived through worse than whispered rumors. The waitress approached him, a tentative smile on her face. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, with wide eyes and a nervous energy. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked, her voice soft. The commander met her gaze and nodded slowly. "Coffee, black, and a toast, no butter." Her eyes darted down to the prosthetic leg, and for a brief moment he saw the flicker of judgment in her expression before she masked it with a professional smile. She took his order without saying anything more, walking away with a slight shake of her head. He couldn't help but notice it, the way people saw him. He was just a man now. He had been just a man for years, ever since he had come back from the war. But there was a time when his name was known in military circles, when he had commanded respect, when he had been the one others looked to for guidance, for leadership. Now he was just another casualty of time, of age, of being forgotten. The prosthetic leg had been a constant reminder of what he had lost, but it was also a symbol of what he had gained. The courage to keep going, the strength to move forward, even when the world had told him to stop. And that was what mattered. What had always mattered. Back in the diner, the clock on the wall ticked steadily, the minutes moving by in a blur. The commander's thoughts turned inward, thinking about the life he had lived. He had given everything to his country, only to come back home and be discarded like an old rusted piece of equipment. The people around him, they didn't understand. They couldn't. No one could. They saw the wheelchair, the metal leg, and they assumed weakness. But they didn't know about the battles he had fought, the missions he had completed, the lives he had saved. They didn't know about the secrets he carried with him hidden deep inside. In the far corner of the diner, two men sat at a booth, talking in low voices. They had been watching the commander from the moment he walked in, their eyes trained on him with a mix of curiosity and caution. One of them had a phone out, subtly recording the commander without his knowledge. It wasn't the first time this had happened to him. People loved to take pictures of the disabled war hero, to post them online and let others speculate about who he was and what he had done. But what they didn't know was that this commander wasn't just a war hero. He was someone who had seen things, done things that would shake the very foundation of the world they thought they knew. He had a history, one that no one in this quiet little town could possibly fathom. The waitress returned with the coffee, her hands shaking just slightly as she placed the mug in front of him. "Here you go," she said, her voice wavering just enough to make the commander raise an eyebrow. She didn't look at him directly as she spoke, instead glancing away toward the two men in the corner, who were still watching. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. She nodded quickly, backing away. But as she did, she looked back once more, and for the briefest moment their eyes locked. It was a fleeting glance, but it told him everything he needed to know. She knew. She had heard the whispers. She wasn't going to ask questions, but she knew who he was. And just like that, he knew it was time to leave. The tension in the air had changed. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt like a trap, waiting to snap shut. The commander took a long sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him, and stood up, leaving the money for the meal on the table. As he moved toward the door, his eyes met the two men in the corner once again. This time, There was no mistaking their interest. One of them shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while the other made a subtle motion toward the pocket of his jacket, where the outline of something, maybe a weapon, was visible. The commander's hand went instinctively to his own side just in case, but he didn't flinch. He simply walked out the door, into the cool night air. But as the door shut behind him, a voice followed him into the night. The words were muffled by the door, but the tone was unmistakable. The commander felt his pulse spike. "We know who you are, and we're coming for you."